seminary, this is the uniform. So I'm officially within the uniform. So
Yes.
okay. So let me ask you a quick question. Has Naomi been broken?
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Has Ruth been broken?
I think so.
Has Boaz been broken?
Hard to tell.
Just think about the fact that he survived famine.
Uh-huh. Sure.
So we're looking at three people from whom God has entered into their brokenness in very different ways. And we're going to continue to see that. And today, as we look at chapter 3, the beginning of chapter 3, verses 1 through 9, we're watching people who have first returned to the covenant promise. Chapter 2, all about recognizing the fullness of that covenant promise. Now we're talking about remaining in that covenant promise. And what we're going to see is, we're going to see that Ruth and Boaz do, Naomi doesn't. This is a little bit of a difficult passage, and the reason it's a difficult passage is because it is so incredibly convicting. As if we haven't been convicted by this little book already. This is convicting from this standpoint. We're going to see Naomi walk very specifically in the way the world tells us to walk. We're going to see Ruth and Boaz walk very specifically in the way the Word tells us to walk. The very big difference of what God says we should be about and what the world says which we should be about, and how they come into direct opposition to one another. We're in a period in which we're in that year-long period after the death of Mahlon and Chilion, in which we still see Ruth, interestingly enough, according to the Jewish heritage, we still see Ruth in a mourning period. So she is still in the year-long mourning period, and that's some of the background coming into chapter 3. And let me do just a little bit of a backup, some review, if I could. We now know Ruth and Naomi have returned from Moab, the washpot. This Moabitess outcast, along with Naomi, have come back to Bethlehem, the land of bread. The famine is over. We know that Ruth wanders aimlessly by happenstance into a field to glean according to the covenant promise that they're supposed to, widows and orphans are supposed to be cared for by being able to glean in the fields. She wanders into Boaz's field, who happens to be a close relative. We saw last week the word goel, meaning kinsman redeemer, and this is going to be exploded in chapter 3 and chapter 4. And we see Boaz shower grace upon grace upon grace upon grace upon her. And then we see that she, in turn, showers that grace upon Naomi. We see that this wonderful cascading of grace, if you will, from God to Boaz, Boaz to Ruth, Ruth to Naomi. Now, let me ask you very specifically, going into chapter 3, have you ever heard this statement in this book so far? And Boaz fell madly in love with Ruth.
No.
Have you seen it was love at first sight?
No.
Okay. Just to set the stage here, have you seen two people in Ruth and Boaz that are in love with God?
Yes.
Okay. That, and when I see scholars, commentators over and over again that say this was love at first sight, Ruth walked into the fields and Boaz went, whoa, I want her. We don't see that anywhere in this text. What we see is a man who loves God, recognizes how graced he's been, and he showers that grace upon Ruth. Now, let's make no mistake, he has seen her character. He has seen who she is and how she has cared for Naomi, who happens to be a relative of his. And so, no doubt, he has gone above and beyond, but we've seen him go above and beyond with his servants. We've seen him go above and beyond with his reapers. We have seen him over and over again be this man of character. We called it a Hayil, this mighty man of valor, this man of great character, great strength. And he has showered that upon Ruth, a woman who we will see again in chapter 3 is a woman of great valor and great strength. So we're in that year period. We've seen now how God has responded, though it has not been the parting of the Red Sea, the moving of mountains. It has not been this miraculous thing. And yet we've seen God do unbelievable things in the life of Ruth, who never thought that this would be where she would be. And we're seeing it vicariously through Naomi, who never thought this is where she would be. So as we launch into chapter 3, the convicting part about this is, I promise you, the convicting part of this is that we're going to see ourselves in Naomi like we've never seen ourselves before. And me in specific. This is why this is a very difficult passage to talk through, because I see myself so much in Naomi. And if you haven't seen yourself in Naomi now, get prepared, because this is where we're walking. So let's begin. I've titled chapter 3, Remaining in the Covenant Relationship. We're going to look at verses 1 through 9. And what we're going to see in these opening verses, verses 1 through 5, we're going to see how the world tells us we should respond. And we're going to see this in the person of Naomi. In verses 6 through 9, we're going to see the way the word tells us to respond. And we're going to see this in both Ruth and Boaz. Again, this wonderful contrast between the word and the world. So let's start. Chapter 3, verse 1. Then Naomi, so this is now this is the continuation of the story. We know that Ruth has been gleaning in the fields and now gets to glean for both the wheat harvest and the barley harvest as she's dwelling in the house of her mother-in-law. Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter." Now notice, how does the storyteller describe Ruth here? This describes her in the family. This is the daughter. And listen to what she says. I want you to pay very specific attention to what she says. "My daughter, shall I not seek security for you, that it may be well with you?" Let's take a step back. This sounds, from the world's perspective, this sounds really good, doesn't it? This sounds like Naomi really cares for Ruth. But let me ask you a question. Can Naomi truly give Ruth security?
No.
Have we seen already in chapter 2 and in chapter 1, where does security come from? God himself. And has God not already begun to supplant that security in her?
Yes.
Has Boaz not said to her in chapter 2, "Come under the wings of the Almighty"? That will ultimately be a quote from Psalm 91. God has now provided food. He's provided a household. He's provided protection. He's brought in the goel. There is security upon security upon security upon security that's coming. And what we get here is Naomi, who says, "My daughter, shall I not?" In other words, shall I not be the one to provide you with the security? I'm going to put it in this perspective. We see at the end of chapter 2, Naomi begin to turn spiritually back toward God. And right now, all of a sudden, what she recognizes is she wandered into Boaz's field. This is the goel. This is my opportunity to see all this come back, see everything redeemed. I better take control of this.
Oh, wow.
Now, let me just ask you, have you ever been in a situation where you said, "God, I'm not quite sure I trust you. I better take control of this"? Now, be honest.
For sure. Yes.
Have we been there?
For sure. Yes.
God, you're not quite doing this the way I think you ought to do this. God, you're not quite doing this as quickly as I want you to do this. God, you're not answering this the way I want you to answer this. Here's what Naomi says. "My daughter, shall I not seek security from you?" Now, by the way, that word security can be translated refuge. Does that sound familiar from Psalm 91, where
Mhm.
David says, God is the one who provides the refuge? This is, and as a matter of fact, if you look back at chapter 2, verse 8, look at what God has already provided through Boaz. He's already provided. Boaz saying to her, I'm going to protect you. My men are not going to touch you. You go get the gleanings. Get the best of the gleanings. Stay with my women. I'm going to provide you food. Over and over again, the bountiful protection of God on Ruth is amazing. Interesting enough, where's Naomi during all this time?
At home.
At home.
She's still at home.
Home.
So she
Body.
hasn't been out in the midst of God providing this protection. So Ruth comes back, and Naomi's first response is, I better take control of this. I got to make sure this all happens correctly so that, and I love her second phrase here, that it may be well with you. Now, please understand, I think Naomi has Ruth's best interest at heart. But if Ruth's best interest is met, whose best interest is also met?
Naomi.
Right.
So have we ever been in a situation where we've told somebody else, yes, you ought to go do that, and by virtue of the fact if they do that, I benefit? We ever been in
You're
there?
meddling. You're meddling now.
Like I said, incredibly convicting. So here's this statement that Naomi makes. We want her desperately to begin to follow where Ruth and Boaz have. Now, keep in mind again, Ruth and Boaz have been out in the fields. They've been working hard. They've seen God's provision over and over again. Ruth comes back, lays the provision at the feet of Naomi, and Naomi goes, oh man, this is great. We got to take advantage of this. We got to get after this. We got to go make this happen. So let me seek security. Shall I not seek security for you that it may be well with you? I want to make sure it's really good for you, Ruth, because if it's really good for you, it's going to be really good for me. And not recognizing yet, how about if Naomi said to Ruth, my daughter, praise God for the security he has provided for you already. You begin to see the difference, the shift in what's happening, where Naomi is still sitting in what the world says. And the world says, grab it. The world says, go make it happen. The world says, go do it. You've got to do this. This sound familiar today? You have to seek your own self-interest. Now, I want to be real clear. Go to Philippians chapter 2, and you'll see, don't look out for your own interests only, but the interests of others. But in looking out for our own interest, what the scripture tells us is that our own best interest is seen by pursuing God's best interest for us. It's not in pursuing our own selfish best interest. If my self-interest is rooted in what God says is good for me, then I'm pursuing the right self-interest. And then I can shower that self-interest on others, look out for their best interest. Here, Naomi isn't yet saying, let's pursue God's best interest for you. Naomi right now is still saying, I'm going to seek security for you. I'm going to seek refuge for you when God has already begun to provide it. The unfortunate thing is, because Naomi hasn't been out in the field, she hasn't recognized it yet. So, the interesting thing also is when she says that it may be well with you, let me ask you this question. Is it already well with them?
It is.
Yeah.
They got food. They got the goel. They got now 12 weeks of food. They've got the promise. They're back in the homeland. They're back in the blessing. Naomi has Ruth. Ruth has Naomi. There's a lot to be thankful for. And yet she says it's like she's setting a completely new standard of what well means. And by the way, well means the standard that I set, not the standard that God has set. So as Paul says, learn to be content in all circumstances. Is Naomi content yet with what God has provided?
No.
She's not yet. There's a whole lot in this first verse, isn't there? I'm sorry, I'm overwhelming you with what's here, but we miss where Naomi is if we don't dive into this deeply. So my daughter, and I still say Naomi's got a wonderful heart for Ruth, but I think there is some very definite selfishness related to this. So, shall I not seek security for you? I'm setting the standard. Again, we just begin to see Naomi's wheels turning about how she's going to control this circumstance. So, we look at verse 2. She says, "Now Boaz, whose young women you were with, is he not our relative? In fact, he's winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor." Now, if you really don't see her wheels turning, here's where they begin to really crank into gear. Boaz, whose young women you were with, is he not our relative? Now, earlier in chapter 2, Boaz was described as the Goel, the close relative, the kinsman redeemer. Do you know that's not the word that she uses here? The word that Naomi uses here is, "Now Boaz, whose young women you were with, is he not our friend?" It's the Hebrew word for friend. It's not the Hebrew word for goel. This gives us a little bit of an indication that Naomi may be considering here that the Redeemer cannot do it all. I've got to help him. I gotta manipulate the Redeemer a little bit to get him to actually do what I want him to do for me. Whose young women you were with, is he not our friend? In fact, case in point, he's actually going to be on the winnowing floor tonight, winnowing the barley on the threshing floor. Now, she knows what's happening. She knows the time period. This is an agrarian society. This is a big deal, by the way. The harvest has come in, and they're up on the threshing floor. What we see now is the beginnings of a scheme of Naomi's to get Boaz to actually play the role of the kinsman redeemer. And let me just ask you something. Has Boaz already begun to play the role of kinsman redeemer?
Yes. Yes.
Yes. He has already done that. And by the way, we're not talking about love at first sight. We're not talking about him being wowed by her beauty. But what we see is Naomi now beginning to take advantage of, this is what I see. I need him to play this role because it's going to serve my best interest if I can get the Redeemer to do what I want him to do. So, here's what I'm going to ask you to do. This is what I'm going to tell Ruth to do. This is the scheme that's getting ready to be hatched. Whew. Here we go. Verse 3. Therefore, because he is going to be on the threshing floor tonight, and I'm going to walk you through the threshing floor here in just a minute. It's an incredible picture of God at work in our lives. Therefore, because he's going to be on the threshing floor, wash yourself, anoint yourself, put on your best garment, go down to the threshing floor, but do not make yourself known to the man until he's finished eating and drinking. Okay, let me talk to you about the threshing floor real quick. Lay the surroundings so you get the backdrop here. There were 3 steps in harvesting the grain. The first thing that happened was the actual gathering or the gleaning. This was the gathering of the grain. So you cut the stalks off, you put it in bundles, you carted it up to the threshing floor. The threshing floor is a flat space on top of a high hill. Very specific flat space on top of a high hill. Now think about just how much grain might have been there. If Ruth gleaned one day and got 30 pounds of grain, and this is 6 weeks of gleaning with multiple servants. How much grain? I mean, we don't get an indication, but this is a huge harvest. So the grain comes up onto the threshing floor, and now they do what's called the threshing. This is why it's the threshing floor. They would either take the grain stalks and beat them on the ground, or they would have their oxen and carts trample the grain. This was to separate the actual wheat seed from the stalk. So now you have all the stalk has been removed, and this threshing, this beating, actually removed that. It got to the nugget, to the real heart of the grain itself. Then they would do what was called the winnowing process. Because they're on a high flat plain on a hill where the breezes would blow, they would take long rakes, get under the grain, throw it in the air. The breeze would come through and take the chaff, the light stuff, the chaff away from the grain, and the harder grain itself would fall to the ground. So what's left is this hard grain. This is the actual grain that's left. Now, let me liken this a little bit spiritually for you. The threshing is that part and parcel in which God takes us through really difficult times. This is when we're actually refined in this process. This is where God is looking for that nugget of truth, that nugget of our character, that thing that he's trying to draw out. And sometimes that's a painful process, like a little bit of a beating, a little bit of a threshing. He's getting at the grain that everything else is trying so hard to hold on to. He's got to separate the stalk, get all of that other stuff that's holding on to this nugget, the things of the world that are choking it out to get to that nugget. And then when we get thrown up into the air, it's the wind. Now, what's another word for wind?
Pneuma, spirit.
Spirit, pneuma. Pneuma is also not only the word for the spirit, but it's also the word for wind. So the wind or the spirit comes through, convicts us, and pulls the rest of the chaff away from us. So God working in conjunction with the spirit to get at the very root of character in us, the thing that needs to grow and survive, that good wheat harvest. God takes us through a threshing process, and then with the work of the Spirit in us, takes us through a winnowing process to actually get to the ripe grain, the thing he is trying so hard to cultivate in us, to grow in us. Isn't that just a beautiful picture? This agrarian society that went through this process to get at the rich grain is what God does with every one of us, to get to the rich grain of truth that's residing in us. So we get this beautiful picture of the threshing floor. The grain is being harvested. There's this huge mound of grain. And now with the threshing floor, here's what the men did. They would have a party. They would celebrate the bringing in of the grain. They would celebrate God's blessing upon them for the grain harvest that was there. So they would have a party up on the threshing floor. After the party, they would lie down to sleep. And if you had the grain in the center, the men would sleep like spokes on a wheel with their heads right at the grain and their feet coming out, and they would line themselves up all the way around the grain, like spokes on a wheel, their heads at the grain and their feet out at the base. The reason for that is threefold. First, they wanted to protect their grain. So in that position, any person who was coming up to steal their grain, they would have to get by the length of their body and their head being closest to the grain, they would know immediately when someone was coming after their grain. But the second thing that they did, this was an act of worship by the men, because it was their heads, which is the place that they worship God from, their heads. This was that acknowledgement of who God is and what he has done, which is why they placed their heads right at the grain. It was just this beautiful act of worship around that grain for them to say, God, we recognize you, what you have done, what you've done in our midst, and now we celebrate you. We praise you for that. So we get this beautiful picture of what's happening at the grain harvest up on the threshing floor, and the men who are now protecting that grain and worshiping God for the harvest that has been brought in. Make sense? You have the picture? We good? Okay. So now here's how Naomi wants Ruth to play into that fixture. So in verse 3, she says, therefore, because they're going to be on the wind, they're going to winnow the barley tonight at the threshing floor. They're going to have this wonderful celebration. This is all going to happen. Therefore, wash yourself, anoint yourself, put on your best garment, and go down to the threshing floor. Now, remember where we are. We're in the mourning period for a year.
Right, a year.
What Naomi is actually asking Ruth to do is to violate the covenant mourning period of mourning over the death of her husband. She's basically telling her, go doll yourself up, go put on your best clothes, go anoint yourself with perfume, get to really smelling good, look really good, get out of your mourning clothes, And I want you to go to Boaz on the threshing floor. Now, let me just ask you for a minute. Where has Ruth been for the last 6 weeks? Working in the field. Where's Boaz been for the last 6 weeks?
Working in the field.
Has Boaz seen her at her worst?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. She hadn't looked fantastic out there. But what has Boaz recognized in her? He's recognized her character,
Mm-hmm.
her virtue, her work ethic, her love of God and the covenant promise in staying true to doing what the covenant, her humility. He has recognized an incredible look at this woman's character. And yet Naomi's saying, we got to make you look really good. we got to go make you look good for Boaz. Really look good for Boaz. Do you begin to see the scheme here?
Mm-hmm.
So go there, get out of your mourning clothes against what the covenant says we should do. Put on your best garment, which, by the way, that garment, that is a garment of concealment. It is meant to cloak you so that you are concealed. Don't make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. In other words, best mood. I'm trying to set the scene for you that this is absolutely the most advantageous time for you to go into Boaz and make to meet Boaz at the threshing floor. Now I want to make sure we really understand the ceremony here. Remember, Boaz is a man of high character. So it's very, very, very unlikely that he was, as some scholars have suggested, that he was drunk. This is not what we're talking about here. They have celebrated by eating and drinking. They have celebrated God's bringing in the harvest, the blessing of God on them. So if you've had a good meal, you've eaten, and you've had your fill, what do you feel like doing?
Sleeping.
Sleeping. This is the advantageous time because you're cheerful, which we're going to find they're going to say here that he was cheerful. That was his spirit. Nowhere in this text does it say he was inebriated. It says he was cheerful. What we get from this is Naomi's looking for the absolute best time for Ruth to present herself. This is the scheme, and I'll say it again. Boaz has seen her every single day, working in the field. He's noticed her, but he's noticed the important thing about her. Remember, God looks on the inside.
Mm-hmm.
God looks at the heart, not on the outside.
Mm-hmm. Right.
We begin to see where Naomi's head is. So what we get here, and an incredible statement we get here, is this look of how Naomi is working the angles to get Boaz to do what Naomi wants Boaz to do. And by the way, just so we leave the undercurrent here, the Goel was supposed to be the Redeemer anyway. He's supposed to do this anyway. And do we have any reason to believe right now that Boaz would not fulfill the role of the kinsman redeemer, the Goel? No, we have no reason to believe that he wouldn't because of what he's already done, what he's already shown. Now, I want to take a break here for just a minute because I want to tell you a story. Are you familiar with the book Pride and Prejudice?
Yes.
Is John's not there, right? I didn't.
No.
John. So if John was here, I could say, John, I'm going to give you an education into Pride and Prejudice. My wife is a very big Jane Austen fan. Our dog's name is Lizzie. Our previous dog's name was Emma. Our previous dog's name was Darcy. We have 2 birds. We have Woodhouse and we have Bingley. We're Jane Austen to the walls. But you know the story of Pride and Prejudice. A household with 5 women. The 5 daughters, and in that time period, what you had to do is you had to marry your daughters off to wealthy men because their wealth would then keep your wealth intact. This is how, because the property didn't move from daughter to daughter, it moved from son to son. So you had to keep the wealth intact. So a wife's job, the Mrs. Bennet, the head of the household, her primary focus in life was to marry her daughters off well. Now, there's a particular scene that happens in Pride and Prejudice where Mr. Bingley, a wealthy man of $5,000 a year, moves into the neighborhood. And they have an older daughter named Jane. And you may remember the scene in which Jane has met Mr. Bingley at a dance. There's obvious some attraction that's been there. There's obvious that Bingley likes her. It's obvious that Jane likes him. And yet Mrs. Bennet goes into Naomi mode. Here's what she does. An invitation comes from Mr. Bingley's sisters to ask Jane to come for lunch. Jane looks at her mother and says, "May I take the carriage?" Her mother says, "No, you have to go on horseback, for it looks like it's going to rain." The idea that Mrs. Bennet has is if she will ride over on horseback, she's going to get wet. When she gets wet, she's going to be sick. When she gets sick, she's going to have to stay in their house for a long period of time. Therefore, she's going to see Bingley a whole lot more. Let's not mention the fact that she's going to look her absolute worst when she's sick. But
No kidding.
she's going to be around. So here you see Mrs. Bennet trying to manipulate the scene by saying to her, "I'm going to set this up so that you are forced to be around him and to be around him for a long period of time." Jane Austen's father was a preacher. He was a pastor, and I have no doubt in my own mind that the Book of Ruth was in some way, shape, or form a little bit of the story behind potentially Pride and Prejudice. Here is Naomi, the Mrs. Bennet, scheming to get her way so that the other man will notice her daughter. Does this just...
Makes sense.
I mean, yeah, there's a part of me that just says, way to go, Jane. Bring the Bible. Way to go, Jane Austen. Bring the Bible into this story. So here's what Naomi is doing. Naomi is doing what the world says. Look out for your own interests and scheme to get it. Do what you have to do to get ahead. Scheme to get ahead. And yet what we get in the story is how much God desires more for her and has already begun to provide more for her. So this huge thing that occurs when you go to verse 4, what you see is, "Then it shall be when he lies down that you shall notice the place where he lies. You shall go in, uncover his feet, and lie down, and he will tell you what you should do." The problem that happens when we scheme is that we absolutely sacrifice what God has for us already, which is better than we could possibly imagine. We short circuit God's best for us. And what we get with Naomi is wanting the best. I do believe that, but she's short circuiting what God has already begun to do, what God has already put in place. And this is, like I said, this is very difficult because I do this all the time. I short circuit God. I get in front of him. I try to push his agenda. I try to push my agenda. This is what we see is this hard, convicting statement about what Naomi's actually doing. So when we do this, we get things out of order. We get ahead of God's timing. So verse 4 says, "Here's what I want you to do. Then it shall be when he lies down," so when he's in the best possible spirit, when he's in the best possible mood, don't make yourself known to him until the right advantageous point. Then go in, uncover his feet, lie down, and he will tell you what you should do next. So there's 3 rules of scholarship, 3 levels of scholarship on what Naomi has just asked her to do. And I want to walk you through those 3 levels of scholarship here because I have a very specific landing place on this. The first level of scholarship is this, that what Naomi is asking Ruth to do is go seduce Boaz. Get your best clothes on, smell your best. You're going to go to him. You're going to be the best looking thing around this group of men, which, by the way, the women were not allowed on the threshing floor.
Oh,
So
great.
you're not supposed to be up there, but I want you to look your best, and you're going to find the most advantageous time when he's had his fill of eating and drinking. He's laying down. He's asleep. This is when you go in, and the uncovering of your feet, there's one level of scholarship that says this is an act of seduction. You are going to seduce him. You're going to make him recognize you and seduce him and go be with him. The second level of scholarship says that this is an act of submission. That you're going to go in, you're going to uncover his feet, he is an honorable man, and he will act responsibly. He will respond to your act of humility. The third thing, which is the one that I really think is going on here, is that this is an act of supplication. That you're going to ask the Goel. I don't think this is in Naomi's mind, but we're going to see Ruth actually do this. Ruth is going to walk a very fine line between her promise to do what Naomi says and actually what the covenant promise says to do. But the act of supplication was this. You're going to go in and you're going to actually ask the Goel to be the Goel, to be the Redeemer, to accept her, to protect her, and to provide, to actually redeem her. So what Naomi says in verse 5, so Naomi says, go do this. This is my scheme. I'm going to have you all dolled up, all dressed up. I'm going to have you looking your best, smelling your best, and you're going to be around all these smelly men who've just finished the harvest. They're going to be happy and they're going to be sleeping deeply, and you're going to go in and you're going to make yourself known to him. And Ruth says this in verse 5. Ruth says to Naomi, all that you say to me, I will do. So this is Ruth's falling in line with the covenant promise she made to Naomi. I will do what you tell me to do. And you're going to watch this. This is going to be fascinating because Ruth is going to walk the fine line of actually doing everything Naomi says to her to do, but then actually does what the covenant promises tell her she should do. She's going to walk by the word, not by the world. So are we clear where we are right now? We clear what's happening, the balance of what's going on here. So again, remember, go back to chapter 1, verses 16 through 18, and we see this is how Naomi is still feeling. She's still walking in this, I went out full, you brought me back empty. I'm still bitter. These are the things that are going on. Ruth is the one who has stepped into doing everything that should be done and done properly, done by covenant promise. So we don't want to sacrifice what God has for us. We don't want to get ahead of him. We want to wait patiently for God to do what God is going to do, because when we allow God to do that, the benefit and the reward is so far beyond anything we could imagine and anything that we can scheme to get. Okay? This is actually a beautiful picture of Romans 8:28. God works all things together for good to those who love him and who are called according to his purpose. But I want to put a little twist on that. God works all things together for his good, which is ultimately for our good. What God is desperately trying to do here is to do his good, which is the covenant promise. And what Ruth and Boaz are walking in is God doing his good, which they have recognized is their good. Naomi's not quite there yet. She's coming. She's going to get there at the end of chapter 3. But she's still trying to scheme to get what she thinks is her good. And she's short-circuiting God's work. Okay? Let's look at 6 through 9, because now we get to what I call the way of the word itself. Now, where we seek the world before, now we're looking at two people who actually seek him. We're going to look at Boaz and Ruth. Verse 6. So she went down to the threshing floor, did according to all that her mother-in-law instructed her. Notice she was obedient. She did all that her mother-in-law instructed her to do. She got dolled up. She anointed herself with perfume. She got in the cloak. She got in the right clothes. She went to the threshing floor. She stayed hidden until the right time. And after Boaz, verse 7, had eaten and drunk, and his heart was, what?
Cheerful.
Cheerful. Why would it not be? A huge harvest. They've had a celebration. God has richly blessed them, especially after coming out of a famine. And Ruth comes in, lays down. He went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain, and she came softly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. So now, right now, she has done everything the way Naomi has instructed her to do, correct? Okay. So Ruth's done everything she's supposed to do. Boaz is cheerful. She is obedient. But now watch what happens. Now it happened at midnight. And let me just stop there for a minute. They bring in the harvest during the daytime. The sun goes down. They have a meal. Let's say the meal lasts a couple of hours. So it's now about 8 o'clock. They lay down. She goes in and uncovers his feet. How long do you think she's there?
A long time.
A couple of hours, maybe?
Yeah, at least.
4 or 5.
So let's say if it's midnight and they lay down around 9, fall asleep around 10. Let's just put this into round terms. She's been there between 2 and 3 hours.
Mm-hmm.
Does this just show her willingness to be patient for God's timing?
Mm-hmm.
God, she didn't go in there, whip the blanket off of him and say, "Yo, Boaz, it's me. Let's do this thing." She doesn't do that. She goes in, she uncovers his feet, which I think is this beginning of the act of supplication with humility. And she waits, and she waits, and she waits, and she waits, waiting for God to work the way God is going to work through the Goel. She came softly, she uncovered his feet, she lay down. It happened at midnight that he was startled. He turned himself, and there a woman was lying at his feet. So all of this happens. She comes in, she does everything she's supposed to do. She simply uncovers him and she waits. He startles. He sees a woman at his feet. Notice it doesn't say that he recognized her. Notice it doesn't say that she was overbearing. She didn't get up. She didn't shake his shoulders. She's startled. Maybe his feet got cold. Maybe, who knows why, but he startles. Verse 9 says, and he said to her, "Who are you?" You ever been startled out of a deep sleep?
Mm-hmm.
Do you immediately recognize somebody standing over you?
No.
Probably not. And let's be honest, she probably looks a little bit different than she did in the field, but it's pitch black. He recognizes there's somebody there. He says to her, "Who are you?" And look at her answer. This is fascinating. She says, "I am Ruth." And remember, her name means friendship. So I am Ruth. He doesn't say, "I am the Moabitess." He doesn't say, "I'm your daughter." He doesn't say, "I'm the daughter-in-law." She uses specifically, "I am Ruth." Let's make no bones about who I am. I am Ruth. And then she says this, "Your maidservant." She's still walking in this humility. Remember, Boaz has elevated her during the day. During the 6 weeks, he has elevated her status. He's put her in with the reapers. He's put her, eaten lunch with her. He's elevated her status from being this widow, this bottom of the barrel woman, this lowest of the low in the order of society. He has brought her up, and yet she uses again the same statement, and we talked about this a week ago. She uses the same statement that only Mary, the mother of Jesus, has called herself. Now, there have been others who have been called maidservants, but only 2 women in all of Scripture have ever called themselves maidservants, Ruth and Mary. And they do it out of an act of humility. Remember, Ruth says it, or Mary says it when the angel proclaims, "You will have a son. He will be called Jesus. He's going to be the Son of God." And she says, "Let it be to me, your maidservant, according to your word." She is submitting to what the angel says and actually what God says is going to happen. We get this beautiful statement here that Ruth says, "I am Ruth, your maidservant." We just get this wonderful biblical connection between Ruth and Mary, these 2 women of humble means. Actually, these 2 outcasts. And then she says this. Boy, this is really strong. Then she says, "Take your maidservant under your wing." What we see here is we see Ruth walking in the covenant promise, asking the Goel to do what only the Goel can do. She asks the kinsman redeemer to be her protection, to be her refuge, to be her goel. She makes this request. Now notice she doesn't demand it, though by the covenant promise she could have demanded this. She doesn't. She comes to him in humility. She comes to him as a servant, and she requests that he be her redeemer. Let me just ask you a question. Is that not indicative of how we should approach Jesus Christ? Think back to when you became a believer. Did you demand that Jesus save you? Or did you make a humble request? Lord, be my Savior. If you're like most of us, you made a humble request because typically Christ probably came to you in a moment of brokenness, a moment in which you recognized your position of standing in front of the Son of God. This is a beautiful picture of how Ruth has come and stood in front of the Kinsman Redeemer, this beautiful picture of Christ, and humbly requested the Redeemer to redeem her. It's a marvelous, marvelous picture. She says, take your maidservant under your wing, and then look at what she says to conclude this section. For you are, and she uses the word goel. You are the close relative. You are the kinsman redeemer. She recognizes the kinsman redeemer for him who can only do what he can do, and she requests that he do what only he can do. It is just this beautiful, beautiful picture of really what we should do with Christ, and the view that Christ did already what only Christ could do in saving us. And frankly, the beautiful picture we get with Ruth is that she's already experienced the goel, doing what only the goel could do, allowing her to glean, providing food, giving her a place of refuge, protecting her, putting his wings over her, watching out for her. And now she makes the formal humble request to actually now become the kinsman redeemer. She does it with humility. She requests his protection, which was her right to request. She uses the scriptural reference that he used previously of coming under the refuge, under the wings. And she requests his redemption as part of the covenant promise. She's walked and she's basically asked him to do what the covenant promise says he will do. And he has shown across the board that he will do that. Isn't this a wonderful picture? Don't you just kind of want to go, yay, God?
Yeah.
So I love the quote, and I want you to hear this. Chuck Swindoll said this, and I'm going to paraphrase it a little bit. Swindoll said, so here is a servant asking the boss to marry her. Unheard of, unthinkable, but it gets worse. It's a Moabite asking an Israelite to marry her. It's even worse. It's a woman asking a man to marry her. A little Sadie Hawkins-ish. It's a poor woman asking a rich man to marry her. And Swindoll asked this question. He says, was this an act of foreign naivete, or a daughter-in-law's devotion to her mother-in-law, or is it another sign of the hidden hand of God? From the world's perspective, the scheme was doomed from the beginning as a hopeless gamble, and the responsibility Naomi placed on Ruth was quite unreasonable. But it worked because of the Redeemer. Just a fascinating, beautiful, marvelous picture of what we do with Christ, of our Redeemer, what he has already done for us. All the things that Boaz did for Ruth, and already the things that Boaz did for Naomi, he had already done them. The protection was already there. The food was already there. The refuge was already there. He was already beginning to do the redemptive work that was to be done. And now Ruth, walking in the covenant promise, steps in and says, would you please be my Redeemer? Now, let's say again, where's Naomi?
Home.
So I just want to ask this question. Naomi had the right to go glean. She doesn't. Naomi had the right to go to Boaz, kinsman redeemer, and say, redeem. She doesn't. Naomi puts Ruth in the situation by manipulating the scene to try to get what she wants. And by the way, it's what God already had begun to provide, but she's still so far away from God, she hasn't recognized it yet. To tell you how much we need to stay close to the God of the universe to recognize what he's doing. And then we get this beautiful picture of the threshing floor that God is working on us. He's working on our character. He's threshing us, and he's winnowing us with the power of his Holy Spirit to bring us into the type of character of a Ruth, the type of character of a Boaz. Because what he wants from us is this. He wants us to understand that the unthinkable, the unheard of, the impossible, the thing that is beyond my imagination is something he desires to have us walk in. If you think about Ephesians 3 says, now to him who is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all that we ask or think, according to the power that works in us, to him be the glory in the church by Jesus Christ to all generations forever and ever. Ruth had no idea in 1 year that this would happen to her life. Now remember, Naomi was sending her back to her gods. Naomi was sending her back to a life of death. And all of a sudden, in less than a year, God has worked to bring her food, family, a roof over her head, a place to belong, a people to belong to, and walked her into the covenant promises of God. For Boaz, in this year's period of time, God has introduced him to abundant harvest, to a woman of great character, to the possibility that he could actually be the answer to someone's prayer. He has walked Boaz through some tremendous things, and he's recognized it. With Naomi, he's brought her back home. He's brought her back in with family. He's given her back the hope of food, the hope of children, the hope of survival. She's still trying to manipulate the scene. God's done so much that if we just step back and watch and see everything that he has done around us, we're going to see a God who has been at work and never stopped working for our benefit, for his glory, and our good. So here's the final question as we kind of wrap up this little section. The question is this: what drives me? Is it the world or the Word? Whose interest do I seek? Mine or his? We know our God is an incredible God, and he has our best at heart. And unfortunately, the world tells us that we can scheme to get our best. And when we do that, we sacrifice the work of God. But when we seek him and we submit to him, he unfolds something that's beyond our imagination, something that's beyond what we could ever dream or think, because he has a supernatural best for us. Thoughts, questions, comments. Hang with me, because Naomi, she's coming. Into chapter 3, she's going to finally lock on, but we got one more section here to go through of this relationship between Ruth and Boaz before we get there. Any thoughts? Ideas?
I had a question about Naomi. Was she following a custom or a Levite law in sending Ruth? Or I think you said something about she should have gone to Boaz?
She could have gone, yes. She could have gone and requested Boaz to be the kinsman redeemer. He was the family. He was a relative of her husband. So she had the right. And I think Swindoll's got it right. She places a pretty unreasonable demand on Ruth.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Because this was,
Would she
Ruth
be?
is, yeah. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Would she be asking him to marry her then?
No, no. She would be asking him ultimately to redeem the family, and there's more to the redemption than just the marriage into the family. We're going to see this in chapter 4, because there is the buying back of the property, there's the inheritance, there's the buying back of the legacy of Mahlon, Chilion, and Elimelech. There's a lot more that goes into being the Goel than just the marriage. And again, chapter 4 is going to really unfold that for us, because we're going to see in chapter 4 that there's another guy who's actually a closer relative, and we're going to see his character versus Boaz's character. But this was still something that Naomi, as the head of the household, still she had every right to go to Boaz, and she had every right to go to Boaz and say, under the covenant promise, let us glean. Under the covenant promise, be our kinsman redeemer, buy my property back, restore my household. And knowing the character of Boaz, he would have done it. She's putting a proxy out there. I still say this is where she is mentally, spiritually. She's begun to return to God. She's physically back in the land, but there's still this. She's had 10 years away from God. There's still this scheming of, God's not going to do this. Maybe he hasn't recognized it yet. Maybe this hasn't happened yet, and I got to push this along. And the best way I can push this along, by the way, is I'm going to put Ruth out there and make sure Boaz recognizes her, make sure Boaz sees her. And maybe she thinks the request is easier coming from this young woman than it is from her. But she could have walked in that promise as well.
I have a question about what, is there any way of knowing about what age Ruth was at this time and about what age Naomi was at this time?
Yeah, we think Ruth was probably somewhere in her early 20s.
Okay.
And we think maybe mid, if she married around 14, 15 like Mary did, and there were 10 years in Moab, so put her 24, 25, 26. Now we've got another year, so she's probably mid-20s, maybe latter part of her 20s. And if you look then at Naomi's probably somewhere in her 40s, maybe late 40s, early 50s. Okay. But remember, the lifespan back then was probably 60 or 70. It wasn't a long, probably more in the 60s. So that's about the best we can get. We do know that the entire, so go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, doesn't that put Boaz closer to Naomi's age than Ruth?
It can, but more than likely, if he was a relative of Elimelech, we don't know if he was an older or a younger.
Okay.
Could be that Boaz was probably in his 30s or 40s, but he's going to make a statement to Ruth in chapter 4 where he says, basically, blessed are you of God because you didn't go after the young men.
Young one, yeah. That's one reason I was wondering.
Yeah, so definitely he's older than she is, probably more in line of mid-40s, somewhere around there that we think. Hard to say because there's... Yeah.
It just seems odd to me that Naomi, I know it's God's providence, but that she would tell this young woman to do this thing that she told her to do, and I just think she should be ashamed of herself, and yet I know what you mean, because that's kind of how we operate when we're walking in the flesh. We do try to take control of things and kind of stay out of the way so it doesn't look like we're doing that.
Well, absolutely. The interesting thing to it is, I think there's a huge part of this that this story says, do you recognize God even in the small things around you? Do you see his grace abundantly upon you? Because if you do, then you're less apt to try to step in and wrest control away from God on the things in your life. You're more apt to walk in the patience, to walk in waiting upon him, to trust him. And, there's a whole lot to be said for I trust him mentally, but do I actually get down to the point where I trust him enough that God, it's yours. You take control of it. You do it. There's a lot of that's trust built because you trusted him once, and then you trust him again, and then you trust him again, and then you trust him again, and you see that happen.
Yeah.
The beautiful thing about Ruth is she was an outcast. She didn't know God from a hole in the wall except through Naomi. And here she is walking in the covenant promise and watching God absolutely reveal himself and bless her abundantly for being obedient in the small things. Go glean, be humble, work hard, be a woman of good virtue, make the request in the right spirit, do the things that are the right promise. Just some beautiful statements. And like I said, for anybody who says, gee, we're still being a little harsh on Naomi, she's going to get there. But you can see, and this is what makes it so difficult, we want her to be walking in the covenant promises because we see the beauty of it. We see what God does in it. And we don't want her to be sitting out here still trying to scheme to get what she wants. We're going to see at the end of chapter 3, she's finally going to rest in allowing the kinsman redeemer to do the work that only the kinsman redeemer can do. And it will be, I mean, I can just imagine an audience when the storyteller's telling the story and we get to the end of chapter 3, though there aren't chapters, and she makes this one statement, there's probably cheering. I can just hear applause going around for people going, yay, Naomi, you finally got it. So, yeah. Yeah, and then we're gonna watch God redeem. Yeah, we'll see God redeem dramatically. So, other thoughts, other questions?
Is there any evidence that Boaz had other wives?
There's no evidence to that that we have of the text that he had other wives.
In your reading?
I've seen no scholarship at all that says he did. That he was a wealthy landowner and had not married. There's no scholarship that leads us to that he had multiple. It's a great question, and it may play a little bit into when he has this run-in with the other relative that we'll see in chapter 4. But I will tell you, he's just this marvelous, righteous man. Great question. There's no scholarship to say that he did.
But were the Jews allowed to take more than one wife? See, I thought that was part of their, I mean, David, I know, messed up and did that, but Solomon and all of them, but this was before David. I mean, she was his great-grandmother, right? Or great-great-grandmother. And so I don't think the Jews, I don't think they took more than one.
It wasn't part of the culture, and it was still part of what God said don't do. There's an interesting, I'll say Chuck Swindoll again makes an interesting statement related to David and all of his wives. And he said, it's an area where we think David was not obedient to God to have multiple wives. Being king, many of those were arranged marriages so that nations would be brought together. But he said, David suffered for that.
Yeah.
And if you look at Absalom, David suffered for that. An entire nation. And the fact of the matter is, David was not the greatest father in the world. Neither was Solomon. There's a number of Old Testament characters with multiple wives that you would not pattern great fatherhood after. And maybe that's the offshoot of that disobedience to God. We're getting into a whole nother area of discussion. Any other thoughts? Any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sitting here kind of thinking out loud, but thinking of Ruth and doing what Naomi told her to do. It's like I remember as a new believer, I would have done anything that my spiritual leaders would have told me to do at that time, because I just remember being so new and so excited to see what God would do. And so maybe that's one reason she didn't even question Naomi. She was learning to walk in what God wanted. And maybe that's why, I mean, I would have been so mortified to get all dolled up and go down to the threshing hole and seeing all those other men in a spoke, and all of that. I would have been just mortified, but she doesn't say that she was. It just says she was
No,
obedient.
it doesn't. Remember that she had made a covenant promise to Naomi.
Yeah,
So
right.
there is that level, and I think that's where Swindoll says this was an unreasonable request from Naomi to put this on Ruth to go do this. Ruth still walks in it, and then the beautiful thing about what she does is she actually walks in it and is obedient to the point that then she becomes obedient to the covenant promise. So she's obedient up to the point of saying, here's where I draw the line. Now I'm going to request. I'm not going to seduce. I'm not going to push this. I'm not going to make this happen.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to do what Naomi told me to do, but then I'm going to go and request humbly for the Redeemer to redeem me. And it's
sweet.
just a beautiful picture of that obedience.
I have a question. If there were so many men all the way around there, how did she know which one was Boaz?
More than likely, since he was the leader of the pack, this was his field. He probably had a place of prominence around the. He more than likely it was pretty obvious who he was and which one he was. Great question. There's nothing to indicate. Boy, wouldn't that have been an interesting thing to uncover the feet of the wrong guy?
One.
Yeah.
God is in charge, right?
Yeah. Well, I would say more than likely he had a place of prominence because it was his field and it was his harvest. So he more than likely had a place of prominence around the grain that would have been pretty easy to pick him out. But it's a great question. I've not seen anything in the scholarship that said how did she recognize him. Don't know. Good question. Good question.
Very good.
Mark, would you find this to be true that with Naomi's scheme, God did allow it to go forward? Even in the scheme, it did happen. He didn't squelch it.
True.
And he did bring goodness out of it in an amazing way.
Yes.
And how gracious God is to us that if I say the thoughts that come my way and plans, I'm surprised he doesn't squash me like a bug because of the plans that are totally opposite of his way.
Yeah.
And yet God in his graciousness and his kindness and his patience, he did work out good,
He did.
even though
Yes.
she schemed.
Well, and even put into this, I'm going to take an even step beyond that. Not only did she scheme, but remember what she said about God in chapter 1.
Oh, yeah.
Got his
You
letter.
brought me back empty. You're to blame. So she is bitter against God, and now she's scheming against God, and God still extends grace.
Patient.
And let's not forget that he still extended grace to her to get her to come back from Moab. He did not leave her or forsake her out in Moab either. So it's a great statement. There's just this, God does work, and he does work for our best. And many times he works for our best whether we recognize it or not, which all that makes me want to do is to say, God, I really, really want clarity of vision. I want to see you in and around me all the time, because the more I see you in and around me, the more I'll be able to respond appropriately to you working in my life. Great
I have
point. Great
seen
point.
a threshing floor, so my imagination just let me picture this, as we were going through it. Very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you ever want it, there's a bunch of YouTube videos. If you just go to YouTube and plug in threshing floor, you'll see them actually. There's still places where they actually thresh the grain and they actually winnow
Right.
it. And,
Well, this was at Mount Vernon, and they
Okay.
do. They have the oxen there.
yeah.
True.
So you can still actually see the way it was done. Really fun. Anything else?
In the Kinsman Redeemer,
Yeah.
in the Kinsman Redeemer relationship, do they have to actually go through the formalities? I'm thinking of Judah and Tamar.
Yeah.
And you know that story.
Yes.
Would he have been her kinsman redeemer unknowingly? He actually paid for her services. But yet she married his son. He died. The brother-in-laws would not do their
Right.
duty. So she went to him unknowingly. So was he a kinsman redeemer at that point, or because she didn't go through the formalities?
Well, yeah, basically she sets it up where he is, as having should have been the kinsman redeemer, he's actually shown you didn't fulfill the role. And actually she puts to shame the other brothers too. You didn't fulfill the role. We get here the appropriate. The appropriate is you make the request. Now, the beautiful thing about what Boaz is going to do here is in chapter 4, or at the end of chapter 3, he's going to say, I'm going to do this. I'm going to redeem you, but there is another one you have to go through first because there's a closer kinsman redeemer. There are some pitfalls. There were some very definite things that made it difficult because remember, kinsman redeemer is not just the levirate marriage portion of it. Kinsman redeemer also said you have to redeem the land, you have to redeem the name, you have to redeem the honor, you have to redeem the family. And that also meant a splitting of the inheritance. So what we're going to see in chapter 4, and I'm getting ahead a little bit, but the guy who's the close relative says, hey, if it's just the land, I'm in. And then Boaz says, and oh, by the way, you got to marry Ruth in this, and that means you got to produce a son, and that means you're going to split your inheritance. And he says, I won't.
I'm out.
Yeah, he literally makes the statement, I will not be the redeemer. The beautiful thing about what Boaz says is at the end of chapter 3, before that ever happens, Boaz says, no matter what happens, I'll redeem you. So there is it's a great question. There is a formality to the request, but notice Boaz is already doing the work of the Redeemer. He's already doing the work of the kinsman redeemer in their lives. So he's already fulfilling that role. And let's bring this spiritually forward to us. Christ waits. He is a gentleman. He will not press himself upon you. He waits for you to make the request, be my Savior, before he actually will do that. So there is a request that is made, and I'm going to walk you through. There were Old Testament rules to doing this for the kinsman redeemer to actually be your kinsman redeemer, and I'll walk you through those when we get to chapter 4. So kind of hold on to that question a little bit. It's a great question, but yes, there is an appropriate series of steps to ask the kinsman redeemer to be your redeemer. That makes sense? Did I?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Good question, Celia. Okay, anybody else have any questions? All right, Mr. Mark, thank you so much, and
Righty.
we'll see you next week, and we'll also see you on the 23rd.
That's right. If you haven't register today. It's going to be a marvelous conference and concert, and love to see you there.
Yes. All right. Have a great afternoon.
Okay. See you later. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Charlie and I are posting.